All right. I was racing the clock, so I ended kind of quickly on that last part. So a couple more things on milk production. If you look down, like I said, this is really good. Most of this we did talk about on the previous slide, so don't feel like you have to memorize this. But I did want to point out, following childbirth, number 5 says as long as breastfeeding continues, more prolactin is released, and if the nipple is not regularly stimulated, milk production will cease. So we mentioned earlier that this is an example of positive feedback, and that's what we mean by that. Usually, especially if you're not lactating, you're not going to produce milk, and the body doesn't make that much milk anyway. The more you breastfeed, though, the more prolactin is released, and the more prolactin is released, the more milk is released. So if you breastfeed, you'll produce more milk, which means that you can breastfeed more, which means you'll produce even more milk. So remember, positive feedback just means that we're going further and further away. Now, on the other end, it says that when you stop breastfeeding, prolactin is not released, so milk production will cease. So that's how you would breastfeed originally, if that's an option for you. And then after you stop breastfeeding, milk production just stops. All right. I mentioned if that's an option for you because there are some cases where a woman can't breastfeed. It's just not possible. But if it is, we're going to go over some reasons, some benefits for breastfeeding. Let's jump down here. Let me move the screen a little bit. All right, there we go. So benefits of breastfeeding. I would know these. Just kind of write these in your notes out to the side. It could make a good kind of a short discussion question. So benefits of breastfeeding, again, if this is an option, it's not for everybody. But if it is an option, the reason that this is so beneficial, first 3 are for the child, is that breast milk has optimal nutrients. It's got the perfect mix of healthy fats, some good whole fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. So like lactose is a sugar that's found in milk. Those are found perfectly. If you're a newborn and you need to be growing really rapidly, you need a lot of healthy fat, protein, and carbohydrates. It's got a ton of calories, protein to help build, carbs for energy, and it has all of those things. Number 2, this is a benefit, I guess, for the child and for the parents, is that it's easy to digest because everything in there is so useful that there's not much leftovers. There's not much waste. So what that means, and here's the bonus for the parents, is that the feces is less nasty. It doesn't smell, it smells, but it doesn't smell terrible because everything that was in the breast milk, for the most part, gets used up. So the waste is not really that bad. And also, you're going to have less dirty diapers. Now, urine, wet diapers, you'll have plenty of those. But as far as feces, there's going to be less of that because everything's being used up so much so that there's not that much waste. And then number 3, this is a big one, is breast milk passes on maternal antibodies. We talked about in the lymphatic system chapter that a newborn's antibodies, or their immune system, is not very well developed for the first several months of life. So if you are breastfeeding during those first months, even though the child, their lymphatic system is not functioning and their antibodies aren't being produced, they are getting antibodies from the mother, so that can protect them from a lot of diseases or a lot of sicknesses. And then this is kind of like a side note. It's for what it's worth. For the mother, one of the big benefits is that breastfeeding costs a ton of calories. You burn a whole lot of calories by breastfeeding. So you can burn up to 500 calories a day. That is the equivalent of running 5 miles. So cut mom some slack when you say, well, you're just caring for the child and like you take off work and you just sit at home and breastfeed. That's the equivalent of 3 miles a day as far as calories just from breastfeeding. So that's significant. That's really good. So burn a lot of calories. Just by comparison, when you were pregnant and you were growing the child, you only needed on average about 350 calories a day more than usual for the child. So that's another, kind of a side note when you hear people say eating for 2. That's not really the case. It doesn't mean you get to eat double the amount of food, and that's all of that is going to be needed for the child. Only 350 calories on average extra is needed, and your body needs those for growing the embryo and the fetus and the newborn. But breastfeeding burns up to 500 calories a day, so that's pretty significant. All right. Postnatal periods. We're going to very quickly go through the rest of your life after birth. These are just terms that we use to describe the different stages and some of the major events that happen. So neonatal. All right. If you want to write some prefixes out to the side, this could be kind of healthy. Let me shift the screen back a little bit. All right. Natal means birth. So when we've been using the term prenatal, like we talked about prenatal vitamins, prenatal means before birth. So everything up until that section about birth was prenatal development. Neo means new. So neonatal means newborn. It's just a fancy anatomy way of saying newborn. So the neonatal period is from birth until the end of the 4th week. So basically the first month of life, you were considered a newborn. Newborns begin to, everything that they were dependent on the mother for during pregnancy, they can start to do on their own. So they can carry out respiration, breathing. They can obtain nutrients by eating. They can digest nutrients and excrete waste. They can regulate body temperatures and make cardiovascular adjustments. There's a little bit of a learning curve for some of these. So if you've ever seen a newborn, they have to regulate their body temperature really, really strictly. One of the first things they'll typically do is put them under a warmer because they've been dependent on the mom's body temperature for their heat. Now they have to start producing it on their own. All right. After the 4th week, from the 4th week until the 1st year, that is considered infancy. So I know we use terms like baby and infant, but these are like the real definitions. An infant would be from 4th week till 1 year. Growth rate is extremely high at this point, so it's not uncommon to be doubling your birth weight pretty regularly just because you're so small when you're born. Teeth begin to erupt, so you start to see teeth. That can be around 6 months or so. Muscular and nervous system matures. So you start to get a lot more kind of muscle and nervous system coordination where you can, instead of like flailing arms around, you're going to start doing things like walking or grabbing or holding things. And then communication begins. So first off, just kind of cooing and like crying is considered communication, but you could start to get some verbal communication. You'll see the first words during this time. All right, childhood is from 1 year to puberty. Now that can change depending on when that is, but usually early teens is when you would see puberty. That's considered childhood. Growth rate is still really high, so children, if you look at the percentage of their body weight they're increasing every year, is still going to be really significant. Permanent teeth begin to appear. So the baby teeth fall out and permanent teeth come in to replace those. Muscular control is achieved, so we can say that we feel pretty comfortable, walking and jumping and skipping and things like that. So muscle control is achieved. Bladder and bowel controls are established. So we no longer need diapers. We are continent and we can hold our urine. And then intellectual abilities mature. So obviously children are not like fully mature intellectuals, but you start to see a lot of progress in that department. Adolescence is puberty to adulthood, so early teens until adulthood. Person becomes reproductively functional and emotionally more mature. That's debatable, but we know what we mean, that you have the capacity for bonding and things like that, and forming relationships in adolescence, understanding consequences for actions and things like that. Growth spurts will continue to occur, but for the most part, we're not growing anywhere near as much as we were as an infant or a child. But you'll see a growth spurt where you might grow several inches within a year, and then it'll kind of stop, and then you might grow a little bit more. Motor skills continue to develop and intellectual abilities continue to mature. So we're kind of continuing all of the progress that we've made during childhood. Adulthood is adolescence to old age. The person remains relatively unchanged anatomically and physiologically. So once we hit adolescence, as far as our body systems, they're working pretty regularly. That continues in adulthood. We do see degenerative changes begin. So at the end of most of the chapters, there was a lifespan changes section, and we talked about how things change as we age. We start to see most of those changes begin during adulthood. And then lastly, the last stage is senescence, and that is the term for old age, or you can put elderly or just old age out to the age, senescence. This is old age to death. Degenerative changes continue. So all those changes we started to see in adulthood are going to become more and more pronounced. The body becomes less able to cope with the demands placed on it, and then death can result from various conditions and diseases. So we're going to look at some of, this sounds weird, we started off with pregnancy, and we're going to end up looking at common causes of death. But this is kind of the most common ways that our body is not going to be able to hold up and keep with the demand. So again, there's the life stages. This is really everything that we just said on those last slides. And then we have aging-related changes. Now, this is, like I said, the lifespan changes that we've had at the end of every chapter, so I'm not going to go through all of these with you. I do want to point out, though, notice that like the first few words for these are always degenerative losses. Skeletal system, degenerative loss. Loss of muscle, degenerative changes. Reduced hormone, degenerative changes, decreased. So the point is, all of our organ systems are not going to work as effectively as we start to age. Again, we've covered all of those individually in the chapters. I would know the ones for the reproductive system because we did cover that in the reproductive chapter last time. But everything else, just know that it doesn't work as properly, and I think we kind of knew that already. All right, causes of death. Now, this is a little outdated, so this is 2013, but we're looking at total causes of death percentage-wise when we break down why people die, and we're going to look at the different causes of death. If you'll notice, there's no like natural causes here, so this is if there is something that we can say this is the cause. The other thing is that it seems like in the past we would say people died of old age, and we don't see that as much. There's a couple reasons behind that. Number one, we're living longer, which is great. So that means, and you would think that means more people are dying of old age. But as we live longer, that means that gives us more time to develop conditions like heart disease or cancer or things like that. All right? All right, so heart disease is the most common. Almost a quarter of people who have a cause of death is going to be heart disease. Very closely behind that is cancer at about 23%. And then there's a pretty big drop-off after that. So chronic lower respiratory disease. This is going to be things like emphysema, issues like that. So lung issues. Stroke after that. So lack of blood flow to the brain. Unintentional injuries is going to be things like a car wreck, gunshot wound, things like that. Alzheimer's disease, diabetes is 2.8%. Nephritis, nephrotic syndrome, or nephrosis, so kidney issues, are going to be about 2%. Influenza and pneumonia are about 2%. And then suicide is down at number 10. Now, first off, we would go, okay, suicide is a very low cause of death. But look, that's 1.6%. That's a significant amount. Like, we know more than 100 people, so that means statistically, someone you know will die of suicide. And it's really interesting because if you'll notice, this is the United States. And for whatever reason, there's a lot of research going into this, that the rates are much, much higher in the United States than others. So that's kind of a side topic. Now, one more thing we can look at right here. Heart disease, cancer, respiratory disease, stroke. These top four can be linked to smoking. Now, the good news is that the rate of smoking is actually decreasing pretty significantly. It's the lowest it's been in decades right now. But we can see why that is so dangerous. Another one down here, diabetes. It looks like it's pretty low. It's only 2.8. We expect this to increase if we don't change anything. Because we've said, I think we mentioned earlier, that if things don't change, children who are born right now, it's expected about a third of them will develop type 2 diabetes. So we would expect that number to go up. Hopefully the others are going to go down as smoking decreases, though. All right, leading causes of death in different age groups. So these numbers are from 2002. This is really outdated, so I'm going to get you to add a few notes that are more the most current ratings. So ages 1 to 44 would be accident. Again, this is going to be things like car wrecks, gunshot wounds, falling, things like that. At that age, the greatest risk is accidents. At that age, you're more likely to do more risky behavior. And the other thing, the reason that we don't see accidents as much as the ages get older is that means you've survived that stage of your life. So it's less likely that that's going to be your cause of death. We have cancer 45 to 64, and then heart disease 65 and over. So really quick, the only changes we have now, current day, accidents are still the most common in 1 to 44. Heart disease is actually the most common for both of these two ages. So 45 to 64 and 65, heart disease is going to be the most common. So that's what we see now. All right, it's kind of a depressing note to end the semester on, but there we go. Watch this. Feel free to review it as many times as you need to, and send me a message on Blackboard if you have any questions. All right, so the final is going to be on reproductive and this section, so study and let me know if you need any help. Thanks.